to say that I think the last panel was an incredible segue to the next portion of our agenda today. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Ellen McCarthy. I'm the president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. And again, we were thrilled to be here today with George Washington. This has been an incredible session. And so I'd like to thank Frank Salufo and his team for partnering with us. We really thought when Frank initially approached us that this would be an incredible event to roll out a paper that the INSA Cyber Task Force has been working on for quite a number of months. And to provide a little more background, we actually, many of the folks sitting here at the table were engaged in a product for Melissa Hathaway when she was leading the Cyber 60-Day Review. And she requested that INSA, as well as some other associations and institutions, provide her some advice. And in our case, it was sort of the private sector's perspective on cybersecurity. And so we did provide a product, and time went on, and it went on. And our task force said, you know, we provided this paper, the 60-day report has come out. We really would like to follow up with some of the recommendations that were made. So putting ourselves in the position of a cyber lead, what would be one of the first things we would focus on? And it really was looking at sort of what is a possible public-private model for cybersecurity. We thought that would be the next first good place to go, and so that's what we did. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists and the members of the INSA Cyber Task Force. The lead of the task force was Lou Von Thaer from General Dynamics. Sitting next to him was Charlie Allen, who's all of you know. He wears multiple hats to include INSA's senior intel advisor. So Charlie, on a daily basis, keeps us straight. Next to him is Bob Farrell. That's Bob. Who is the lead of our Science and Technology Committee, also from Seneca Technologies. Next to him is Barbara Fast from Boeing. Next to her is Bob Gourley, who also wears multiple hats, but I think he was wearing his Crucial Point hat during this evolution. Mr. John Russack from Northrop Grumman, and last but certainly not least, Steve Cambone from QinetiQ North America. So with that, Lou, I'd like to turn over the microphone to you to run through what the task force came up with. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I believe everyone has a copy of the paper in your laps. And what we thought we would do is run this panel a little bit differently. I'll walk through just 3 or 4 slides on the background of what the panel did, and then just open it up to questions from the crowd. You know, we really set out, as the discussions today have gone on, there's a lot of great work going on. There's between government, private sector, universities. Everyone is very interested and engaged, but most are coming out with things that are not necessarily solutions, but ideas of what needs to be considered. So not particularly to have the lead on intelligence and being able to pick out the right way to do this, we thought we would at least look at the current private-public partnerships in our nation that operate today and see if we could grab pieces of those to basically set an existence proof of how you could go about solving this problem, keeping the commercial sector involved as well as industry, and building the true collaboration like we talked about with our last panel. So if you go to the next slide. Our member companies are a subset of our member companies that have involved with the Cyber Task Force. Next slide. So we really set out on the public-private partnership model to look at, you know, what's a reasonable way to set something up, a way that is basically, like we set many of our other activities up, that it is like United Laboratories. You can pick a number of examples, and we studied those, to where it is a positive to be a member. It's a positive to play within that membership, and it's bad for your business. It's bad for your insurance rates. It's bad for you from a legal standpoint not to play. And how could you set cyber up in a similar way that would let us work? So we looked at ways to establish reasonable standards. We looked at particularly how these standards would handle detection, protection, and response. And we thought through who are the key stakeholders, both suppliers, as we've all talked about the supply chain issues today, government as a regulator and a user, and users, which include government, universities, small and large businesses, and individuals. Next slide. So we actually laid out a very simplistic model that would actually set up a cybersecurity panel, much like the NERC operating model for the power industry today that be represented by business, government organizations, individual users, and particularly, as we've talked about some today, privacy and civil liberties advocates. And that organization would provide requirements and partnership to a government regulatory body that would then pass regulation and set standards for how the network and how the equipment would operate. And you can see it's a very simple version of inputs and outputs within this model. Next slide. The methods that we looked through, we put together a small task force. You can see in the paper that we've had a lot of reviewers look back through this, study it, give examples back, and we won't pretend to stand here and tell you we've thought through a detailed protection of all the legal ramifications or all the details, merely a starting point to drive debate. As we looked through these, we looked at 10 existing partnerships that work today, and even others as simple as the Boy Scouts up through things like the Coast Guard and the FAA. And what we really found was no one of those would really work for cyber on its own, but many of them had attributes that we felt were very relevant. And we also recognized there were some things unique to the cyber world that, and we're preaching to the choir in this crowd, that things move at the speed of cyber here. Time frames are very, very compressed. There are authorities and legalities and ownership issues that more than 80% of the networks in the cyber world that we deal in today is owned commercially, and as a result, it can't all be mandated, we believe, by straight government action, and the commercial industries really don't want that. They want to work with the government in partnership. So as we looked through this, we tried to build a model that had representative leadership, private leadership with government support, and the members would be the champion stakeholders that would have proper incentives to provide and motivate collaboration. So next slide. So with that, what I'd like to do, rather than taking up more time from the panelists, is turn it open to your questions for Q&A to anyone on the panel based upon the initial pieces of this, and hear what's on your mind and initial thoughts. Please. Feel free, or we'll jump around.
When that was occurring, I was the Assistant Director of Central Intelligence I was Assistant DCI for Collections. So that was under the previous Director for Science and Technology. I'm not sure what all the lessons were learned. The lessons learned that I had learned when I worked with Mike Vadas and others at the FBI back in the late 90s on cybersecurity issues. I mentioned this morning in my opening remarks. Moonlight Maze, we knocked on some doors. Some doors were open to us. A number of doors were shut, saying Moore's Law will to some degree, they agreed, I think, a little bit with Suzanne Spalding. We can stay ahead. I think now we have a much somewhat different situation out there. I really don't have the background to give you a very coherent, because I only came into DHS in late 05, and it had been in existence 3 years, and that was when that was going on. So I believe, though, that it was sort of a mixed picture under Jay Cohen, who was the Admiral Cohen. We had a very vigorous engagement with the private sectors, and started many initiatives, as you know, particularly not only with the private sector but with academia as well, looking for new and advanced technologies that would help us right across the board in infrastructure protection.
I guess I could take a whack at it from maybe if I could approach it from my government time, and some of the problems that we experienced when I was in government, and that is that especially when our acquisition acquisition ways of doing business are not as agile and not as ready to react as we find in the cyber world. I think that there is more of a willingness to engage with industry simply because you know that you have to do something. You know that you have to do something relatively quickly. You understand that the timing and the technology refresh is going to be different than what's generally inside the acquisition cycle. And so the question then becomes how you actually are able to engage with industry. And that there are a couple of ways that you can do that. And so I can only speak from the lessons learned that I've seen. One of the most effective ways that I've seen is to be able to throw out the problem and see who can come with a solution. So that because what I've found now sitting on the other side is that by and large industry really wants to be a part of the solution. Yes, they want to make money, but in many cases industry is just definitely committed to the problem. This is a national security problem, an economic security problem in this case. And so from a government perspective, I think one of the big lessons learned that I saw was that we had to do a better job in expressing to industry what the problem is we saw it from our perspective and in asking for some help and some solutions. Because left to other devices, what you may have, and I can't speak for this particular problem with Homeland Security, is that individual companies are going to break down the door, and they'll be knocking on the door because everybody's got an idea, and it becomes very difficult for the government to be able to deal with all of those ideas. So I think perhaps that what we're suggesting here in a public-private partnership is to have a little bit better ability to form up these relationships to attack this very, very hard problem, as opposed to a more dispersed way of doing business. And so that's what I would offer to you.
And I would just like to add to General Fass's comments was that when I was there, the tremendous activity that went on in the NPPD, which I think Luther said this is one way to connect this particular P3 model we're setting forth is a dialogue and a collaboration, I think, as Phil Redinger spoke about with NPPD, where we have the infrastructure security advisory councils. We have 18 of them, plus an overarching council. So there is a strategy out there already in place that's been put in place by DHS, where the P3 model, which is being offered by INSA as a way forward, can get traction and take root and flourish. I believe that the work, I think this has a lot to recommend it, not based on my work with INSA, but my work based back in DHS and with people like Colonel Bob Steffen, who drove that effort so well for, I believe, almost 6 years.
Please.
Alan, Building Institute. Did your panel grapple with the issue of legal vulnerability and potential identification issues? Where are we on all that?
Yeah, we don't have good answers for those yet, other than the fact that we know those need to be worked, and we know that on the public-private side, in that cyber panel, we need to have the legal folks involved and the privacy people. Steve, you want to take a crack at it? I know we had talked about this a little bit.
Well, we did, and the short answer is couldn't tell you what the right answer is. The longer answer is that, I guess, what is it that those who want to be indemnified want? Because part of the difficulty we have here, and this is the point I think Suzanne was making earlier about talking to lawyers, you need to tell them what we would like to see done, and that implies that industry, if it's industry doing the sharing and who are likely then to be at risk, they need to know what they want to accomplish by virtue of having shared the information in order to be able to get to the answer of what they want from the government. So Lou made an important point, I think, which I'd like to sort of insist upon a bit, and that is that the approach that we took here was that American society has a long history of sort of going about its own business until such time as it needs some help from the government to finish doing something. Right? So if it was grabbing land out in the West or it was sailing around the world, it didn't matter. People sort of set out to do it. And then they looked for support from the government when it came to a point where effort was insufficient to realize whatever the public good was that was being sought. And that's when historically you've turned to government for that help. So the argument here in this paper is that we really do need to generate that kind of thought in the private sector in order to get to some generally agreed set of things that we wish to see the government, if that's the proper mechanism, implement in the way of indemnification or security, or, I mean, there are many, many, many other features of this. But until the private side of the equation, and it's not just business, by the way. I mean, we were clear to point out, I think, that it's also the, if you will, the NGO interests domestically, universities, businesses. I mean, there's lots of different sectors on the private side. But they need to come with some kind of an approach. They need to go to the government asking for some things to be done specifically that they find to be congenial. Because if we do it the other way around, if the government decides that it's going to tell us what is congenial and it's going to tell us what is and isn't permitted, that ain't going to work. I mean, this is the, somebody was talking about the echo environment earlier. I mean, this is an environment in which it is very easy not to do what you're told to do. But nearly by definition, it was started for that reason. Right? So the notion that the government's going to be able to mandate all of what needs to be done is probably not practical in any case. So there's got to be some kind of private sort of moment here where the public comes together and begins to decide what it is it wants to accomplish, and then asks more specifically what it would like to have in the way of support.
I mean, we really started with a very simple concept. Was one, we were all business people, and we were, and with many with past government background. To be honest, we were scared of having total government regulation around this as we worked to a solution. Whether that could even solve it, and the implications that would have on our businesses and our freedoms to operate our businesses. But beyond that, we really started looking at something like Underwriters Laboratory, right? By going through some simple standards, by some simple testing, everyone involved is benefited, because you can pretty much buy something that has that approval, you can plug it into a wall, and chances are it won't electrocute you. So there's a benefit to the buyer, there's a benefit to the seller, there's a benefit in insurance rates. You know, it's a mutually beneficial support system. And we really tried to look at models like this to expand how we can grab pieces of other models that are out there that shared a mutual benefit when we looked at least a recommendation on how to start this model.
I think the other thing that we looked at from a government perspective is this had to be something that had more carrots than sticks. That you had to look for the positive. It was sort of the white list versus the black list. We're looking for the white list. Where are the positives that we can gain from the relationship, and what would be the incentive for business to participate willingly or for individuals to participate willingly as opposed to be regulated. And we thought that inherently, because of the internet is so fundamental to our way of life, that it really is going to be about incentives, and that incentives are going to work a lot better than regulations. And one of the things that we worried about were too many regulations may not be able to keep up technologically, and we'd find ourselves in the same situation where we are today, where we're having to look at very, very outdated law and regulations in many cases. So we approached this from a carrot standpoint, knowing that there would be liability issues that would have to be dealt with, but that there was that there had to be some protections given to cooperation, and what would those minimum standards look like.
Yes.
Those are all, none of those are government functions. Who's imposing the sanctions, and what do they look like?
In fact, if we can go back a few slides to the model. Actually, we believe, like the FERC operates today, that the cyber panel, as we called it, would actually provide the need for the regulations that need to have happened through agreement from that panel. Then the government would actually be the ones who apply. We believe the government is the one who has to do sanctions. We believe that is inherently a government function, and certainly in times of emergency and other things, the government has a national interest in this. So this was not an attempt to keep government out. This was an attempt to balance the private sector and government interests in a way at which it looked like there was a couple of pretty good models out there today, dealing certainly with other environments, but maybe not that dissimilar.
But it is interesting that the NERC in its earliest days imposed its own. on its members, right, in a legally binding fashion. So it's not an undoable thing, depending on what the purpose is and whether you can find the right set of relationships between the providers and the users, right? So there's an implied contract there, which then is, and sanction isn't always the government punishing. It's also the possibility of being brought to court, right, for having violated whatever provisions of contract there may be, which is probably the better way to do it than a regulatory regime.
There are other PCI standards, for example, that you're aware that really sort of a market sanction programs to say that employer services.
Right. Right.
And we believe from the supplier side that would be true as well. If you had like a minimum, the Microsoft, Cisco, take your pick, would have some minimum standards, and by which if they weren't meeting those standards, there would be a natural tendency of the market not to buy their equipment. So again, it would be mutually beneficial, and by people using the same standards, the equipment would continue to work together.
Could you speak to the panel's considerations of the international implications of the sanctions and regulations? For example, in the IT space, a lot of these companies are doing business outside the United States, and requirements imposed on those countries for reporting, et cetera, within the United States would also, by necessity, be applied to the same companies who report elsewhere. Did you discuss that? What was the nature of that discussion?
Yeah, we did. Somebody want to take that?
So that was discussed quite a bit in multiple ways, and I also want to just point out that we all understand that all standards are not driven by an organization like this. There's the IETF, there's the many standards and protocols developed by corporations and then vetted and turned into community standards, and we know that entire process will continue globally, and we definitely want to support and encourage the innovation there. The kind of standards we're talking about for reporting, like you're asking, we know China is already making moves to say anything that is sold in our country, we want to be able to see every bit of the code because for our own safety, they say. And that's going to be a trend that continues, and it's going to be unavoidable. So what do we suggest? We suggest a framework be put in place where our industry can work together in a collaborative public-private partnership with the government to say what the right response to that is in this country and what we should advocate for globally. So we're advocating a framework where we can raise these issues up and address them. Does that get to your question?
Well, I mean, I guess the extension to that is, do you see those two frameworks being identical, or do you see a different standard for different circumstances?
Well, we may have missed a moment, not the panel, but the country. Again, just to go to public-private sorts of things and the way industry teams with government, if you think about the FAA and you think about ICAO and you think about the way in which reporting gets done there and the standards are set for pilots and what kind of languages people have to speak and who does the investigations and how does all that work, I mean, there has evolved, some of it by treaty, in the case of ICAO, others by domestic legislation. And in Europe, the European Union is doing its own thing at the moment, right, on ground control kinds of things. And that all eventually is going to merge together into some seamless approach to being able to both assure the safety of flight as well as the standards by which pilots are trained and all kinds of other things. Well, it's not impossible to see arrangements like that in a world as complex as this. In fact, you would probably rather see something like that than a single standard, right, trying to be imposed in every set of circumstances that you can imagine. That's just not, again, that's not going to work and people are not going to comply. So if you think about it more from, and I guess the other point we should make, Lou, is we didn't try to suggest you could solve everything, right? So we were sort of interested in the safety of the net, if you will. So if you've got safety of flight, you might want to think about safety of the network or safety of the internet or World Wide Web or whatever your preferred way of calling it. And if you sort of narrow the focus a bit and ask yourself, how could you do it based on ways we have solved similar problems in the past, then maybe there are some ways to do it. Now, the advantage of ICAO is, of course, the United States was on top of the world in 1949, and most of the international flight was being done by the United States. So that was my point about having missed a moment.
But you'll notice in the paper, while we mention it, we got a little bit worried about the boiling the ocean syndrome and thought it would be a pretty pretty big challenge just to get the U.S. act together before we started trying to go beyond that. But clearly we had a lot of discussion around this and realized this really is an international activity that has to be undertaken long-term for a solution.
So there's a related point too I'd like to make, and that is, we all of us come together in so many of these venues. There's so many familiar faces here. There's nothing that really endures with a structure or a framework like this, where we could come together in a routine way to address that kind of hard problem, capture it, figure out what the right answer is, both for industry and if any legislative changes need to occur. So I think your very question underscores the importance of having some sort of existing public-private partnership where we can have a good, strong dialogue on these issues.
We just decided we couldn't boil the ocean, number one. But number two, if we did nothing, we would be in paralysis. We'd still be talking about this 5 years from now because the problem is so big and so hard to solve. And where private industry has a great advantage is that we are operating globally on a daily basis. We are dealing already with customers and with suppliers in other countries. And so there's a lot that will come from the bottom up as well as the top down, but we chose to focus with the idea that there would be follow-on work that would hopefully be done, if not from this study, from the follow-on work, hopefully when we get a cybersecurity coordinator or director or whatever he or she is going to be.
Maybe you answered this question, maybe talking about focus, but one of the questions I had when I first saw this was, if you were thinking about the critical infrastructure in the United States, there are other participants that don't fit the model of hardware, software, ISPs. So you're really talking about computer networks and the internet, not critical infrastructure.
Per se. So the SCADA networks and all that. Well, I'll let others respond, but yes and no. I mean, to the extent that you end up being able to come up with means and methods of ensuring safety on networks, it ought to be extensible to all of those other activities in the infrastructure that are connected to the net.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing.
Yeah.
Probably got there to look it up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But the critical infrastructure is
That's right.
likely to have a major role in all this.
And across the critical infrastructure, you'll see there are pieces of this model operating today in many various forms. So, we believe it's applicable. Where do you draw the lines?
Well, intelligence-led policing and the whole issue of working at the neighborhood level upward, we all know the broken window, and I think Frank spoke of that today, has worked, obviously, in law enforcement across the country. Not every city and not every jurisdiction has had the success, say, of New York or other major cities around the country where this has been. It seems to me, though, that this particular model has enough agility and nimbleness to begin to, from a bottoms-up perspective, to get various interested sectors of our society to begin to look for ways to partner with the federal government or with the public, rather than, and to be able to bring together the two. So that I think there is a agility and elasticity to this model that needs to be explored. What we need, of course, is the government to, INSA will need someone from the government to take a look at this to see its value, and we'll need someone to reach out to, and hopefully someone will begin to think, particularly in DHS and NPPD would be my place to begin this long journey of trying to see if there cannot be more regulation that comes from the bottom up rather than the top down. It won't
was discussion of that model. Lots of us have been involved in those kind of discussions, and we think far more is required than just this to be the full answer on the deterrence model. And so I would say this may be necessary, but by no means sufficient to being able to address those problems. Is that a way you?
I would also say clearly, though, we had a little different take here. We were not just worried about the national attack or the attack of war. We were really trying to think much broader than that. Simple, for lack of a better term, bank robbers, right? Until the bank robbers started getting caught, there were a lot of bank robbers. And how do you work that across the spectrum? So while we looked at that, I think for a couple of reasons. One, for the average law enforcement agency maybe isn't tied into our homeland or our intelligence agency. Deterrence is pretty hard. And two, we were really trying to look at this as a broader operating principle. They could do more than just prepare for counter war, but could actually operate within our commercial networks and our commerce networks as well. So it certainly was part of our discussion, but I don't think it certainly didn't dominate the direction that we went.
I was going to add one point to what Lou said, which is when we discussed this, we said it's probably not the model because we cannot stop attacks on the internet. You cannot have a deterrent that will end attacks. On the other hand, you will also never have 100% reliability on the internet. No attacks. So what we need to have is a model that allows operation in various degraded modes with the highest reliability that we can, and then you have to have critical information that you can secure and know that it's going to successfully pass through the net.
But insofar as it is a social network, and the way that, and I think the point was made in the earlier panel, that the way that the people who are in that society conduct their affairs can have a deterring effect on people doing things to them. So one of the interesting things about the FAA, for example, to come back to that example, is there's a good deal of self-inspection that goes on there. I mean, the FAA has its inspectors, and it does this, but they rely on the people they are presumably overseeing, right, to do those inspections, to make sure that the airplanes are safe and that the pilots are trained and the logbooks are maintained and all those other kinds of things are done, because when the audit comes and it hasn't been done, then there's a great deal of difficulty for that person who hasn't done what they were to have done. Now, what's the effect of that? The effect of that is to make the safety of flight a much higher level of success than it would probably otherwise be if the government was singly responsible for going around and making sure that every airplane that was to fly was safe, or every pilot that was flying was properly trained. Now, occasionally they miss the airports and get lost on their laptops and all that, but that's just the reality of that life in that social network. So if you do it properly, you ought to be able to deter a lot of the bad behavior, the unsafe behaviors. And I think in the end, one of the things we talked about was getting to the point where there was a base of activity and a way of behaving on the net which would allow the anomalous behavior of whatever type to become more apparent. Right? I mean, that's part of what you'd like to see, is a world in which anomalous behaviors sort of stand out as opposed to being lost in all of the noise of the system. Right? So is there a way that you might be able to do that? Don't know, but it's an interesting thought.
Yes, my question is, this happens, is it a better idea for an animal about Russack? Obviously, there are certain things that I can imagine telling software vendors how to fix their vulnerabilities, telling businesses that they have to run certain types of security mechanisms and so forth. I can think of things that might be less controversial, not be effective, certain types of steps that people are supposed to take, they would find themselves, but I don't know what you all are thinking, just in general terms.
John, you want to talk?
Yeah,
We have
let me,
a million.
Let me approach this from a slightly different point of view. If you had a cybersecurity panel or something like it, call it whatever you want, and the government body to deal with, for example, the private sector, we've heard today 85% of the
the nation's critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. It's actually much higher than that in my mind. I mean, if you think about carriers and the internet, you know, it's a lot higher than 85%. If you really think about critical infrastructure, then you get towards the 85% where you're talking about oil and gas pipelines and the electrical grid and the like. So I'm sure everybody in here has read the 60-day study or whatever we call it now, and it's memorized and embedded in your brains. But let's talk about, Steve Chabinsky used the term collaboration as opposed to information sharing. I like that. So most of us up here and most of you out there have thought of additional ways that we could all collaborate. Now, a lot of those additional ways to collaborate require some additional information sharing as a piece of collaboration. You might require, we heard Susan Collins say that a food chain in Maine, you know, had all sorts of cyber issues, and they had nowhere to turn. So if you had the government body, you'd have, you know, who do you go to? And then to increase collaboration, the cybersecurity panel could actually propose from the private sector to include small businesses and non-large government systems integrators, propose additional means of collaboration. And some of those additional means of collaboration might require that the government incentivize certain things. And so you could bring to the government the things you would like to have incentivized so you could actually increase collaboration. For example, we all know about the DIB. Not everybody is included in the DIB. And even though the DIB is a good thing and it's a lot better than what we had in years past, most people would argue that the DIB should be, in fact, expanded. Well, how do you do that? So the cybersecurity panel, or whatever you're going to call it, would go to the government body and propose that things like that get done and make the case, and then the government and the cybersecurity panel could work together to make it happen. That might, in fact, result in additional networks for sharing threat information. They might get funded. It would increase membership in certain organizations that were DIB-like, so that threat information would be shared and the collaboration would be much broader. So those types of things would be some of the things that the cybersecurity panel would bring to the government body. And likewise, the body would be in a position to either, may not be immediate feedback, but the body would be in a position to be dealing with the private sector, you know, we think in a much quicker way. Yeah, I'd just like to add to what John said, because I think it gets back to what Redinger said today about distributed responsibilities. Wants government at the fullest with the private sector to find ways to respond across all levels. There are obviously levels of sensitivity that this model would not accommodate, but there are that can. For example, after September the 11th, pilots and attendants, flight attendants, were voluntarily sent in anomalous activity, suspicious activity reporting, because events did occur on airplanes or near airplanes. That went on for several years. Finally, FAA made it mandatory, but it was voluntary, and it did work well. It did provide a lot of useful understanding within the aviation community as well as at the federal level. So it goes back to John's earlier point of collaboration. I'm sorry, Mark.
No, I'm just going to say that this inherently, too, was a discussion of making sure that the public was involved and that this is part of the education and the dialogue with the American public, and that this is a construct that is not at all a secretive construct. This is a construct that is very open and transparent, because industry has a responsibility to the American public just as government does, and so this was done, as you see, with the idea that civil and privacy and civil liberties authorities would and individuals would be a part of this, because the last thing we needed was something that was so prescriptive and behind the closed doors that we would create yet another problem.
And one other thing I want to mention, we talked about, security and classification, and clearly some things do need to be protected, and they need to be protected by security classification. But this kind of a private-public partnership, once again, it's not perfect, but discussions could be held between the federal government and, in fact, a body like this on how we could, in fact, open the debate, which is what Barb was saying. I mean, what are the things we ought to be talking about more publicly that we presently are not discussing? And really, what do we need to protect and why? So this is not a perfect solution, but we want to get things moving. I mean, let me be honest with you. We want to contribute to the dialogue, and what this panel wanted to do was get things moving. I think an awful lot of us feel that in the past 4 or 5 months, things are slowing down. So, we want to get the debate moving. We do need, how many times today have we heard we need a more robust private-public partnership?
And I think that's a great idea. And I believe, I could see eventually, this group coming out with minimum standards, probably not telling somebody how to fix their software, but, if you're going to drive a car in this country, you have to get a license, you have to get the vehicle inspected, there's certain minimums. And in our computer systems, even though they're every bit as valuable to our way of life right now, we don't have any of that today. You go buy the stuff at Walmart, you either get real or pirated software that goes into it, depending on, what your kids and everybody are up to, and those become part of your network. So I think the DIB's a great example, and those of us that are involved with that know with that came some standards of monitoring and operating, and it's certainly given us a good data point.
I wanted to make one other comment that I hope addresses your question, and that is, okay, so what kind of things might this kind of group do? Well, there is those kind of standards, like the common audit guidelines that a lot of us are familiar with. They just make so much sense, and I think this kind of group could first advocate for them, get even more consensus, then develop just more and more use of common audit guidelines, or asking that every organization implement the latest version of Bind, or implement DNSSEC or IPsec or whatever the best common practices are. Those are things I think this type of framework would be very helpful in further.
One other comment on that is, I think if you think of it coming from the other direction, think of it as we want this system, the internet, to continue to be an open system that people can competitively do business on, create intellectual property, create content and devices which make the network improved and better over time. And so we're still thinking it's a standards-based approach where you protect your intellectual property, you build to the standards, and as Lou mentioned a little while earlier, is maybe there are degrees of goodness of that, where if you certify or if you pass testing, then you have added value to the standard.
I don't think that we at all thought to discount the DoD DIB. I mean, speaking for our own company, we're members and big fans of it, and actually would see that it's an expansion. So I think that it's taking the goodness of what we've seen already. And if you look at this panel, I mean, you look at us. We actually had day jobs, and so we felt that the time to act was really right now. And so there were a lot of 7 o'clock in the morning, regardless of where you happened to be, where we collaborated to come up with this product. And luckily, had some great help from INSA. He folks, but we think that if the paper appeals to you, if it appeals to others, that what we have here is a start point. And there was more that we wanted to do, but we flat ran out of time because we wanted to have it done in time for this conference. And we talked about, should we run this through the knothole of a scenario and see how it would hold up under a scenario? So there are a lot of opportunities to take what's here and begin to work on it. But we felt that we really wanted to do something as opposed to just simply continuing to dialogue about it. And so we wanted to get it on paper.
We have time for one more, Ellen, or are you? Okay, we have time for one more question if somebody asks.
Or no more.
Or we can turn it over to you. It's all yours.
And so, Barb, on that point, we'll be meeting at 7 o'clock next Friday to start running the scenarios through. I want to thank the task force. They really did spend an incredible amount of time doing this in addition to their day jobs. Each of you should have a copy of this paper on or near you, so please feel free to take it. It's on our website. And thanks again to George Washington for allowing us to roll our paper out at this event. So thank you very much.